Hey everyone, welcome to the second of our relaunched PWL Philosophy as a Way of Life International Seminar. Today, I'm really excited to introduce some colleagues who I've been really hoping to find an opportunity to develop a relationship, a dialogue with the International Society for Philosophy as a Way of Life. This is Cam Bellamy and Philip Francis, who are a part of something called the microcollege movement. And in particular, also the organization called the Springboard Foundation for Whole Person Learning. As some of you know, I, for a long time, been really interested in not just conceptions of philosophy as a way of life, but where are communities, institutions, schools that seek to actually develop that transformative process and are thoughtful about what it means to do that in a certain kind of place, what it means to develop a certain kind of community that supports what we call in philosophy as a way of life, spiritual exercises or exegesis, and develops a collaborative space that's transformative towards that purpose, that's thoughtfully in relationship to the rest of culture or society that it's a part of. And in particular, I finally felt there was a propitious opportunity to sort of dialogue with Springboard and places like Land that are a part of the sort of micro-college initiative. Because I was talking to Mike Chase, who many of you know is one of our lead figures in philosophy as a way of life studies. And he was just remarking about as we enter into the age of increasing use of machine learning and chatbots, and as more and more people are distracted by an overly saturated attention economy, what does it mean, especially for young people, to provide spaces of deepness and transformation in a culture that sort of constantly distracts us? And I'm like, well, that's something that some people have thought about for a long time and are actually creating the spaces to do it. So without some much further introduction here, let me just introduce our two speakers today who are going to tell you a lot more about their organization and what they're up to. Cam Bellamy is Executive Director of the Springboard Foundation for Whole Person Learning. She started from a life in the Camp Hill communities, working with people with disabilities, to a career in agriculture and food systems, to her current field of educational spaces. A through line in Cam's life is the dedication to creating living environments in which people can practice new ways of being how they want to be with ourselves, with each other, and with the earth. And Cam's excited about Springboard because it works to ensure young people have opportunities to imagine and make real otherwise. From communal living to governing their daily life and the world around them, Springboard is about developing practice grounds in which young people can create the world they want to inhabit. She's been a really lovely dialogue partner over the last few years, thinking about how to do this in our current times. And Philip Francis grew up in a boatyard in Georgetown, Maine. He learned to philosophize in the salty mix of lobstermen pragmatists and back to the lander idealists. I love that image. After painting the bottom of many a boat, he took his questions on the road to liberation theology-based camps in Nicaragua, intentional communities in India, and monasteries in Greece. He settled down at Harvard Divinity School, where he completed his doctoral work in religion. He completed a postdoc at UPenn and professorships in Carleton and Manhattan College, before returning to his home state as associate professor of philosophy and religion at UMaine Farmington and founding Land Institute, which he's going to talk about today. There's some other stuff that they'll both give you more of their biography, but for now, let's give them a silent round of applause if you know how to use those react symbols, or yes, just because you're on mute. And I'm really happy to have this conversation today. And yeah, I'll pass it on to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction, Ellie.
So glad to be with you all today, and it's an honor to co-present with my dear colleague, Cam Bellamy, and to see familiar faces here in the crowd. Old friend Chris Nye is here. New friend Chris Higgins is here. And yeah, it's our pleasure. Whenever I stand in front of an august group of academics such as this, I always feel this urge to paraphrase John Locke, that all of our combined knowledge is but a grain of sand resting on the edge of an abyss of ignorance. So I think our humble hope for today is just to take one little crumb out of the abyss and hopefully glom it on to that grain of sand. I also feel the urge to quote an even more radical empiricist from this side of the pond, William James. This is from his preface in The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he says, "A large acquaintance with particulars makes us wiser than the possession of abstract formulas, no matter how deep they may be." A large acquaintance with particulars. So as Cam and I were talking about our goal for today, I think that's how we want to frame it. We want to add to the storehouse of your particulars. We know that you bring expertise in philosophy as a way of life, and we want to provide some particular examples of how we're trying to live out some of those ideals that are there in Pierre Hadot and others. So in the story you're going to hear us tell today about Springboard and Seguinland, you'll hear us illustrate a number of just those core simple ideas in Pierre Hadot. We'll talk about spiritual exercises, of course, spiritual exercises, which Hadot says, quote, have their goal as the transformation of our vision and the metamorphosis of our being, the self liberated from mere egotism. Another core Hadotian idea that we'll draw on is his whole idea of the internalization of old truths, which he says, quote, are never exhausted. It's not that they are difficult. On the contrary, they're often extremely simple ideas. Yet for their meaning to be understood, these truths must be lived and re-experienced again and again. So again, we're eager to add to the storehouse of your particulars here by showing the ways that we at Seguinland and at Springboard seek to embody some of these core ideas around philosophy as a way of life. And I'll bounce it over to Cam. No, you're muted, Cam.
Okay, unmuted now. Great, thank
I can hear
you.
you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And Ellie, we can just bounce to the next slide and we'll stay there for a little while now. I want to, thank you, Ellie, for the introduction. That was amazing. And thank you for inviting us. Philip and I have worked together for a number of years now, but I don't know that we've ever had an opportunity to kind of present together in this way. So it's really, it's fantastic. Often we're looking at budget numbers and fundraising goals and things. So it's exciting to have an opportunity to go in a little different direction today. Yeah. And yes, it's really wonderful to also have Chris Nye here. He is one of the founders of Springboard, and the idea for Springboard was seeded in 2021 by Chris and his wife Gingy Nye, who were particularly concerned about the growing challenges that our world is facing. They were particularly concerned about the climate crisis, and they felt strongly that they really wanted to do something to help equip the next generation with the capacities needed to meet these crises. They wanted to support young people in developing inner resources because they had the conviction that inner resources and a moral compass could be cultivated, that it was not something that as a society we could or should leave to chance, but that it needed to be consciously cultivated. In the fall of 2021, I met with Chris and Gingy at their home in New Hampshire, and they shared with me the book, The Nordic Secret by Lena Rachel Anderson and Thomas Bjorkman. And this book tells the story of how Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland grew from really very, very poor feudal agrarian societies at the beginning of the 19th century, and how they grew to become really thriving industrial democracies by the end of the century, and kind of models really for a lot of the world. The book, it makes the case that it was educational policy and particularly investment in rural folk schools for young adults that gave its citizens the grounding to be able to navigate and contribute to an emerging industrial society. The folk schools worked with the German concept of Bildung, which we don't have really a good translation for, but essentially means educating for the complete moral, emotional, intellectual, and civic transformation of the student. And so at a time of really rapid societal change, the Industrial Revolution, the Nordic countries really doubled down on developing the inner lives of their citizens. And the Nordic Secret argues that because of this, they emerged stronger as a society on the other side of the Industrial Revolution. And I think as you were alluding, Ellie, in the introduction, again, we find ourselves at a time of rapid societal and technological change. And so I think it was really prescient that Chris and Gingy were asking, how can we foster a movement similar to the folk high school movement of schools that provide scaffolding for young adults to develop really rich inner lives and a sense of belonging to a community and the world? So after this initial meeting with Chris and Gingy, we embarked on a search for models here in the US of institutes and schools that really were consciously and intentionally cultivating inner resources in a holistic approach, really much as the folk high schools did. And we very quickly came upon Sigwinland Institute, and we had our first meeting with founders Philip and Marcia, his wife Marcia, over Zoom in December 2021. And by January, within a few weeks, I was making a trip up to meet them and stay in one of their beautiful tree dwellings. And
we have tree houses here. If anyone wants to come and visit, put you up in a tree house. Yeah.
Exactly.
Secret of our success, I think.
Yes.
So picking up the narrative from there, I mean, just been such a fortuitous and synchronous connection here with Springboard, so many shared values. But let me take you back. I want to take you sort of into the founding story of Sigwinland Institute, which goes all the way back to 2015. But even before we do that, I mean, you heard from my bio that I came kind of through a traditional academic path, started my teaching career at Carleton College, you know, elite, rural, liberal arts college. Then I was at Manhattan College, a Catholic school in the city, and then returning to my home state of Maine and teaching at a state school. So across this variety of teaching experiences, you know, I experienced the beautiful things about our system of higher education, but also the limits. And eventually I became pretty fed up with the limits, where you feel like you're trying to create this transformative experience, and so much about the system, the way things are structured, even just the way scheduling works at these institutions is working against you. So you're often made to feel like you're trying to create this transformative experience or integrate in these spiritual exercises, to use Hadot's term, and you're just sort of packing them on around the edges. So knowing that many of you are in that same scenario, I want to begin with this thought experiment. Just imagine, if you dare, that you are given the opportunity to create an entire semester-long program for 20 college-age students. They have nothing else on their schedule, and neither do you, believe it or not. And you've got a decent budget, and your goal is nothing less than these Hadoian goals, the metamorphosis of their being, to help them move towards the good life, if you want to frame it that way, to help them move away from a kind of egoistic, self-centered approach to life, as Hadot says, and into something, a much more open approach to others and to being itself. So imagine all of those conditions are in place for you. What would you do? What would the curriculum be? Where would you start this program? What kinds of staff and faculty would you hire? to create those conditions for the metamorphosis of being. Pause as you let your imagination unfurl on that. And I hope you'll continue to imagine that long after our conversation today. So I was kind of in that position in 2015. So we can take ourselves even back to that year of 2015, which feels like just eons ago, like a different world. And me and Marcia and a few others, I think in 2015 we just had this sense that the world was shifting on its axis, that many of the problems in our society that had been growing for decades were now going to be even more pressing and problematic, that the already unsustainable pace that we were moving at as a society was being ramped up yet again, that the kinds of technology we were engaging were transforming us of what it was to be human, what it was to be a relational being. And that was all gonna move even faster in these coming years. And at that same moment, it seemed to us that there were fewer and fewer places where young people could step away from that buzzing and blooming confusion to get clarity on some of these just fundamental questions. What does it mean to live a good life? How do I go about living a good life? What does it mean to have meaningful work in this particular context? So our very simple idea back in 2015 is we need to create a place where young people in those college years could step away and experience a kind of spaciousness of reflection. And I had William James' idea, when he's talking about the definition of religion, it's, among other things, he says, it's a space in which you contemplate life as a whole, where you're not just thinking about one aspect of your life, your career life, your economic life, your love life, whatever, but you're thinking about life as a whole. And it seemed like that was harder and harder to achieve, almost impossible to achieve. Like maybe that capacity was beginning to go dark for us as humans. And we wanted to put a stake in the ground and create a place where young people could think about life as a whole and have that sense of spaciousness, of reflection. So my parents were back to the Landers, who had moved to the coast of Maine, this tiny little town. And so we commandeered part of the old family homestead where there are these little cottages, and we created these immersive programs that we call the Good Life Gap Semester. And the idea was that these would be fully immersive. Everyone is living on site. Everyone is synced up. That students would take a progression of courses. You would take one course at a time. So you'd be fully focused on that course, working in depth with one faculty member. That there would be a shared life, that we would eat meals together, that we would, that our schedules would be synced up, that what we're reading would be synced up, that it's not like, oh, some students are just taking off for the weekends, but truly for that full semester, we would commit to being in this place with this particular group of people for the duration and just going deep with these questions. From the beginning, it was important to us that this was a whole person learning experience, that it was body, mind, and soul, that each day of the program students would feel that sense of being engaged at all of those levels. And Ellie, you could flip the slide there as well, just to give a little sense of our context here. That in short, we'd inhabit this space, and rather than spiritual exercises or this intent to create a metamorphosis of being tacked on around the edges, but that this would be a curriculum that was built from the bottom up around enhancing opportunities for that sort of maximally transformative effect. Each day of our program centers around a theme. So students, they live in these little Thoreauian cottages along the river here. They walk from their cottages over the tidal river bridge up to our treehouse classroom that Cam alluded to. They begin their day with our mindfulness instructor, where they're cultivating some skills in calming and focusing the mind, knitting back together their attention span. That's about 45 minutes. And right after that, the professor of the day walks in and introduces the theme of the day. And then all of the experiences, readings, conversations are centered around that theme. The first course that they take, and it's always been this way since the very first program, it's just called the Good Life course. And it's with me. It's a philosophy course asking that timeless question of the good life. And the first theme of that first course has always been awe and wonder. If I'm the professor of the day, I'm walking in, I'm introducing that theme of awe and wonder. I'm handing out readings. We're doing group readings and discussions, philosophical texts on this theme of awe and wonder. We're reading poems. We're listening to songs that relate to that theme of awe and wonder. I'm sending students off into the woods with their journals to reflect on those readings, coming back, small group discussions, whole group discussions, break for lunch. We eat lunch together. And then in the afternoon, we head off for some experience related to the theme. If it's the day of awe and wonder, that's probably a day we're going to get in the boats, go up the river out to this island that you see pictured in this slide here. That's Seguin Island, which is 3 miles off the coast. And we're going to climb to the top of that island and situate ourselves within that 360-degree view, a place where you almost can't not have an experience of awe and wonder. So students are given time in solitude to open themselves to this experience of awe and wonder, different facets. Collectively, we try to experience awe and wonder, and then we circle up. Maybe you can see in that slide, there's a little circle of humans there. That's our cohort of students, and I'm in that circle there somewhere. They've just spent this whole afternoon out on this island, experiencing something of awe and wonder, come back together, and we're having a discussion. In what ways did the experiences push back on the readings? Did the readings inform the experiences? How were these individual experiences of awe and wonder different than the collective experience? And how does any of this apply to your unfolding notion of what it is to live a good life? So to me, that's, textbook Hadot. This is it's not an idea that's being explored simply in the abstract, but you're given this chance to live it out and then to think how it integrates into your life as a whole. That's just one example, but literally every day of the curriculum is a different spiritual exercise that unfolds something in that way. We might have a day that's themed around, that the idea of impermanence, say. That's a day we're probably reading some combination of Buddhist texts and Simone de Beauvoir, and we're studying the artist Andy Goldsworthy, whose work is all about ephemerality and impermanence that you engage through the natural world. If that's what we're studying in the morning and discussing and experiencing the artwork related at the afternoon, we're gonna at low tide go down in the mud flats and get muddy and create artworks that we know the tide will wash away. Again, a spiritual exercise, ideas not divorced from experiences, an engagement with those old truths, as Hadot said, and I quoted at the beginning there, old truths that need to be experienced and then re-experienced to be internalized. Another spiritual exercise that's part of all of our programs and part of that first course, silence, solitude. We ensure that students do some reading in the importance of experiences of silence and solitude. So there we're, could be reading Taoist texts. We could be reading Henry David Thoreau, Walden, the chapters on silence and solitude. We're reading Dennis Johnson, the poet, on solitude, where he says, the key is in learning to admit solitude as one admits a bayonet, for already it pierces your heart. I love that. Of course, after reading all about the importance of solitude, we send the students off into the woods. We also read this great book called A Stranger in the Woods, which is about perhaps the greatest feat of solitude that humans have ever pulled off. Christopher Knight, a Mainer who drove his little Subaru into the woods when he was like 23 years old and then stayed out there for 25 years. It's a fascinating tale. Anyways, we send students off and they do a whole day of solitude and silence out there. And again, we come back, we discuss how the readings inform the experience informed the readings, and what all of this means for their experience of the good life. Each of these practices is experienced within a highly relational context where every student knows every other student very well, and each faculty member knows each student very well, and each student knows each faculty member very well. I'll say more about that relational context, but hopefully this gives you a little snapshot, a little sense of how we've tried to build this curriculum by integrating in spiritual exercises as the core, not just something that's tacked on around the edges.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Philip. Yeah. Ellie, if you could go forward 2 slides, there's another image from Seguinland Institute. One of the students out, yeah, on her own there. And I said to Philip this morning, I like to see this photo in relation to the other photo also where the students were in a circle, because I think a lot of what you do is helping students to find themselves in relation to a community and a group, but also ensuring that there's time to come back and be really strong and anchored in themselves, that they know who they are, and through knowing who they are as an individual can really contribute to the context of a group. So yeah, I think it's great that you're able to create that space both for alone time and community in a good balance. Yeah. Neat. So I think it's easy to see why at Springboard we were really enchanted with Seguinland Institute. It was obvious, it was apparent to us that Philip and his team, at the time a pretty small team, that they were really consciously and intentionally creating a container in which young people could really cultivate inner resources. They were creating an environment in which students could really wrestle with and come to understand, also in an embodied way, what it means to live a good life. Yeah, yes, you really feel when you are there, everyone there is living a good life. The food is good, the surroundings are beautiful. It's a good life there, and simple. But you know, Seguinland Institute is based in a very specific place, and its lifeblood really flows through very specific people, through Philip and through his wife, Marcia, and the local team that they work with. And, you know, at Springboard, we wanted to create a full movement, a whole bunch of places where young people could cultivate inner resources. And we were very conscious, we recognized that the aliveness that we loved at Seguinland Institute really came from its deep embeddedness in place and from the richness that came from the founders, really bringing their whole selves to the endeavor. It's an environment that's so palpably alive, and as Philip said, they developed it on his parents' homestead where his parents still live, and so the students who are there are surrounded by actual people, living people of all different ages who have spent, well, some of whom have spent decades, like very intentionally crafting a life, and I think that's very visible to everyone who comes to Seguinland Institute. Yeah. And so it was a challenge, is a challenge. How are we to develop a whole field of places or institutes in which young people can develop inner resources and a strong sense of meaning and purpose? How do we do that when the conditions needed to do so are really so dependent on real connections to individuals and to specific communities, to the natural world? So this was a really daunting task. And when I met Philip and Marcia at the beginning of 2022, and again, working with Chris and Gingy, I was finishing up an MBA, and I was surrounded by people just really concerned about questions of scale, kept asking me, how are you going to scale? And, you know, could we scale Seguinland Institute? And yes, that was the water I was swimming in. And the truth is, I knew we could not massively scale Seguinland Institute. And I often felt I was swimming upstream when I told people that we didn't even want to do that. That was not our goal. It wasn't our plan. But the question became then, how would we do that? I was clear, and Chris and Gingy were also clear and super supportive. We knew we wanted to proliferate a number of small scale models. If you could move to the next slide, Ellie, that will show, this will get us down to some brass tacks here. We developed really a three-pronged strategy to grow the field. We decided we needed to, one, establish a field of exemplary models. Beyond Seguinland Institute, where did we see others doing incredible work that we could amplify? We knew we needed to develop a research and evidence base that would demonstrate the impact of these institutes. This meant creating some definition around the field. And again, without holding too tightly to structures or definitions, we wanted to loosely pattern what we saw happening across these unique institutes and to be able to tell their stories in ways that made the work visible and the principles at least replicable. And finally, we knew we needed to develop an ecosystem that would support the flourishing of programs like Seguinland Institute. In the Nordic countries, the folk high schools, which still exist, are still quite common in the Nordic countries. They're independently run, but they're funded by the government, and this gives them a strong base on which to stand and helps them to proliferate. Public policy really supported and continues to support them. But that is really not the case here in the US. And in the Nordic countries, it's known what a folk high school is, and it's normal for a young person to attend. And that is also really not the case here in the US, where there's very little understanding among students and their parents also as to why attendance, why should I take time out from my college, which is leading me to a career, to go someplace like Seguinland Institute. So these were challenges we were facing, and we knew we needed to develop an ecosystem that would be able to meet these challenges. Yeah. So in June 2023, in conjunction with Seguinland Institute, after identifying several other high-quality institutes, we hosted a convening. We gathered 25 students and educators from high-quality microcollege and living learning institutes together to consider how we might establish, solidify, grow, and make visible deeply transformative learning options. Yeah. If you can move to the next slide, Ellie, there's a little picture from the convening there. The picture on the left, just a glimpse into the work we did, and that's actually at one of the tree houses at Seguinland Institute. The report from the convening is on the Springboard website in the resources section. So if anyone would like to see what happened at that convening, there's a very full report there of the work that we did. Yeah, so again, June 23, we had identified a growing number of educators like Philip, were really reimagining what higher education could look like when we put at the center of it the formation of the whole human being. And so we invited those founders who we had met, educators. Also, we invited, importantly, students and student alums of such programs to join us in this quest to make visible what was happening in these transformative learning centers and to identify the guiding principles and to work with us to establish and grow a field of transformative learning. I will say language is something that we still wrestle with today. The folk high school language is not resonant in the US and means something completely different here. Bildung is also not a recognized word. Some institutes at Springboard that we work with identify as gap year programs, some as microcolleges or living learning institutes. So again, we try not to get too caught up in language, but for ease of use and understanding, we often use the language of microcollege and or living learning institute. Yeah. And we came away from the convening, we left the convening having identified the following principles. And if you want to move to the next slide, Ellie, we can see what those principles are. For an institute to be really transformative, we decided there needs to be an intentional focus on transformation. It's not something that just happens. We want to really support places where there are founders like Philip who are really thinking about what it means to foster transformation. We also came to understand the small scale is super important, that students can really know everyone in their cohort and feel known and feel that they are important to a group, that they belong to that group, and that they're of import. They can have impact in that group. Yeah. A place-based learning is maybe an interesting one. We came to understand that the curriculum is designed for the location, again, with an increasingly screen-based world, to provide opportunities for students to really connect with where they actually are, what is real in their world, is important. And that place-based also creates a certain scale in which that allows for the feeling of impact in a local community that you can't always have when you, are trying to protest a big global issue or so. It's easier to feel your impact when you are working in a local setting. Yeah. The communal living aspect, again, students living together, bumping up against each other. The number of stories we'll hear when we talk with microcollege students and leaders about washing the dishes and the ways in which people wash the dishes or don't wash the dishes, and what that means to life and how they work with that, and love people who wash the dishes well and still come to, yes, how they deal with all these issues. It's important. And then this element of co-creation, that students have real responsibility for creating both the curriculum and the community. Philip can tell you way better than I do. The community doesn't work if a student opts out or drops out. The whole community feels it. If you're in a cohort of 20 students and one student is not participating and engaged, it impacts the group. Yeah. Yes, so that was what we came to in this 3-day convening. In the interest of time, again, I won't go into the whole thing. It was a struggle. It wasn't just that we immediately knew that took some wrestling with in this group. Yeah. And maybe we can just move to the next slide, then just share our hypothesis at Springboard is that a durable sense of meaning and purpose grows from the relationships that you have with people and with place, and that especially in a rapidly changing and uncertain world such as we're in now, a sense of agency and self-efficacy to make change both in your own life and in your community. We believe at Springboard that when students have embodied experiences of what it feels like to be connected to a community and to a place, they develop the tools that no matter where they end up, when they leave Seguinland Institute, when they leave their transformative learning program, they know that they can make an impact, and they understand what are the building blocks. They understand how to develop relationships with people and place. And that is really the primary learning. Yeah.
We could bump to the next slide there. Thank you, Cam. Yeah, and just to echo that, I would say that the emphasis on relationality and community building is just central to the Seguinland experience. We never wanted these spiritual exercises to be merely a practice in self-actualization, self-realization, or hooked up to that whole American form of spirituality that can lead away from a sense of the common good. So for us, these spiritual exercises have as part of their intent to empower our students to be community builders. So I can give a few more examples of that. And we definitely want to get to your questions very soon. Just a few more examples of what, the curriculum looks like here. So we might go through a unit where we're reading philosophy of storytelling. where we're reading Hannah Arendt, we're reading M.D. Jackson on, theories of storytelling, the impact of stories, the way that stories allow us to navigate internal realities and external necessities, and the way that stories bind us together. And then, picking up on that co-creative element, we invite our students to co-create an event. So we're in the midst of our spring semester right now. A few weeks ago, our students created an intergenerational storytelling dinner, which we hosted here on site. So we're in this tiny little community, and we invited people of all different ages, but there were many that were in the 60 and 70 plus category. And the dinner was structured around alternating stories, kind of moth style storytelling, and courses of the meal. And while they're eating, there's kind of informal storytelling, but then each course is punctuated with more formal storytelling, one from a student, one from a guest in the community. And then at the end, with our students, we reflected on, what was it like to harness the power of storytelling? Did Arendt's theory bear out in the midst of that event? So you're allowing them to re-experience those old truths, as Hado says. They're exercising those spiritual muscles, and they're coming away empowered to be community builders. So that's one example. On Tuesday, we're going to host, students will likewise create an event for the community that is called the Mad Farmers Award Ceremony. We've been reading theories of ritual in the modern era. What rituals have disappeared? What does it mean to create new rituals? Within that, we've been thinking about holidays and celebrations, and that turned the conversation where students were interested in award ceremonies, in the sort of shallow rituals of so many of our award ceremonies here, whether that's the Oscars or the Golden Globes, and the way that we give out awards for just trivial things in this society, and thus we trivialize ourselves. And so working with students, we created this award called the Mad Farmers Award, where we will honor one local farmer, an unsung hero who's not going to get some other award. And students go and spend time at the farmer's farm, work with them, get to know them, and then students create an original ceremony to honor that farmer. And so students are thinking about ritual theory, what makes for a powerful and impactful ceremony, how do you create some collective effervescence? And so they're writing original songs, they're writing original poems, they're writing, meditations on Wendell Berry. They're creating an actual physical award that will be handed to the farmer, which is going to be, I just found out this morning, talking to, they're going to create a model of the farmer's old truck, which is a 1985 Ford that just has the name of the farm stenciled on the side and isn't even, fully roadworthy. He's had it since, 1985. And anyways, they're going to hand him like an actual replica of the truck as a thing. Anyways, I'm getting too much in the details because I love these details and I love the co-creation of it. So what does a student come away from that experience with? Well, they've thought deeply about ritual, they've thought about ceremony, they've thought about critique of contemporary culture, and they're empowered to be community builders. They're empowered to be creators of that connective tissue between people. Anyways, I could go on and on about other examples of this, but I'll just close out my piece here by coming back to the relationality. My conviction, and I would say the biggest thing that I've learned in running this since 2015, is that the thing that really nurtures that transformation through these spiritual exercises is that context of relationality. That, again, every student has to be well known by each other and by the faculty. And speaking of brass tacks, I just want to say that this involves a lot of faculty time just spent with students. It's sometimes shocking when my colleagues that are teaching at traditional universities are sometimes shocked to hear that, like, when you're the lead faculty for a course here for 3 weeks straight, you are pretty much on with students 5 to 8 hours a day, 5 to 6 hours a week. That's just a norm. Sometimes it might be a 12-hour day if we're going to like head out to an island or we're going off to off-site here. And it just, it's very intense, of course, but I think it's necessary. I think it's absolutely necessary to achieve the kind of transformation that we're looking for. They have to feel like you're in it with them, that you're really shoulder to shoulder with them in these experiences, that these ideas are still very much alive for you, and that you're there with them, and that you believe that transformation is possible. So there's an element of faith there that I've come to appreciate as well. You have to be someone who keeps alive the flame of that idea that it is possible to change, because these young people are worried that they might not be able to transform into the kinds of people that they want to become, and that are ready to meet the challenges of our time. So I'll wrap there and bounce it back to Cam.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Gosh, yes, it does feel like we're in a good way bouncing back and forth between two different themes. You know, I think you're getting from Philip the real lived experience of what it's like to be in an institute like Seguinland Institute, and then of course in our work at Springboard, again, our work is to proliferate models like Seguinland Institute. And so where are we now? Currently, Springboard has, we have more than a dozen partner or affiliate entities, and you can find them, most of them, on our website. We actually are continually in need of updating. We're approached now, we had our official founding in 2022, 4 years on. I would say we are approached by developing programs and new founders almost weekly now. There is demand both from educators and from students, really looking at how can we re-envision how we are educating and the purpose of education, and what we are centering in our educational contexts. So the question then becomes, how do we meet that demand? And I think that's where we turn to you, and I think where we'd like to start the conversation. Yeah. And maybe, yeah, I'll turn it back to Philip a little bit. Maybe, Ellie, if you could move to the questions slide. I guess we can open it up now to questions from the audience, and then we have some questions for you also that we'd love to get context from you. Yeah.
I don't know. Do we have the capacity to imagine a form of higher education in which a critical mass of young people participate in, say, 1 to 2 formative years of spiritual exercises at a microcollege or the like, before matriculating to a larger university to focus on, further development, but maybe more particularly the pre-professional formation. So that's something to keep. I'll just put all these out there, and then, let's discuss whatever you want to talk about. What sort of prepares a professor to teach or guide this kind of spiritual exercise centered form of education at a microcollege? That's a big question that I'm grappling with right now. The opportunities for collaboration, because collaboration is key. We couldn't be doing what we're doing without the collaboration of Springboard and some of these other microcolleges that we're in conversation with. So yeah, what do you guys want to talk about? Where do we want this conversation to go?
It's interesting that the way you're proposing this kind of split model reminds me that it's happened before, right? So University of Chicago said, first you're going to be in this kind of 2-year College of General Studies, then you'll advance to the upper college. My daughter goes to Bard. They have a similar model where you have to moderate or apply to specialize after your first 2 years, which really I like, and finally puts the horse back in front of the cart. You have to show that you've grown in your general integrity as a human being before you're allowed to specialize. So we've seen that model before, and I think that the wisdom behind it was that if you just merge them together and say, oh, we have these gen ed requirements and this is important, that it could just so easily get swallowed up in the overall idea of specialization, pre-professionalism, and so on. So it's a bold proposal to radically split them like you're proposing, and I like it. It gets me thinking.
Yeah, I'll just pick on that to say that I think one common theme, and you can find this in older traditions, but let's use this sort of U Chicago Hutchins College models thing, is that amongst the neoclassicists like Hutchins, to do that, they were actually very aggressive about essentially firing what they saw as graduate disciplinary scholars and instead replacing them with generalists. This led to this, tremendous upheaval at Chicago where there was a lot of tension with the faculty because Hutchins said you just need it's really an order different to be this kind of generalist tutor, pedagogos, I would say spiritual director of the sort of philosophy as a way of life sort. So I think an interesting question you see on the scale question at a greater scale is like, you see the reason why people do this, but it's been a real struggle because people grow sort of resentment about that expectation to be sort of either kicked out of their positions like happened at Chicago, or just natural apathy. Like I know before Quest closed, one thing the founding faculty, this was Quest University in Squamish, Canada, for those less familiar, which I see as having sort of elements of these commitments and sort of same value place, is that they just got into this trap of wanting elite faculty from Ivy League schools that were sort of the best in their field or the most knowledgeable at that area. But that wasn't always aligned with this professor teacher guide model. So I don't know if that answers anything, but that echo Chris, I'm also drawn to it. And in fact, think there's a lot of tension sort of between point 1 and point 2 that I think is interesting and there's lots of lessons from.
Neat.
What about Lucas, others from the philosophy as way of life side? I'm going to pick you a little bit. What does this make you think about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. There's so much to talk about. It's really hard to pick just one thing. But two things I was thinking. The first one is that it was very interesting for me to see this perspective of community-based learning where the students also get to create the curriculum. It's kind of an interesting convergence with another discussion I've been participating in, because in March in Hill Design this year, there was an event to discuss the philosophical curriculum in the sense of how can we include non-Western traditions also in the university curriculum, so we have a broader conception, a broader understanding of philosophy, and what would that mean in order to change the way our graduations are organized and so on. And one of the ideas that came up is basically that maybe one of the most powerful ways to change that is to give students more room to build the curriculum themselves, because when you do that, not automatically, but it's very clear how this is also connected with wanting a more diverse curriculum with other traditions and so on. Mm-hmm. So it seems that, and also not only that, the whole thing of local-based learning is also very connected with what was discussed there, because it is this idea that, look, if we really talk about global philosophical traditions, you can't just have a curriculum that manages to teach everything that it could, and maybe it shouldn't, because maybe we should look at each specific situation, each specific locale, and choose what kind of curriculum would be interesting based on that. So I think this, I would say, and I think Lai would agree with me on that I think this is yet another point in which we can see a very interesting convergence between this perspective on philosophy as a way of life, and also this perspective on philosophy as being intrinsically intercultural, so to speak, and the need to bring other traditions, which is also connected to a different idea of education, for instance, is very fascinating if you think also the context of indigenous education in the original peoples of America, for instance. So I think there might be something to draw on from there. And the second point was that in terms of thinking about this idea, of collaboration between colleges and universities, I was thinking that here in Verona in particular, I've been here for 1 year, but I've been part of a project they have here, which is very brief. It's usually in the first month of the semester, but they do a philosophy and cinema project with students from technical schools here, from you know, and then you have 2-3 days where they watch lectures, watch a movie, and then build a video to talk about what they learned and so on. And this is interesting because it's also meant to bring those students who usually don't have philosophy in their classes because they are in technical schools and so on, to have this first contact and have a different look, maybe have a more critical view of their own education and so on. And I think there could be a possibility of maybe bringing those ideas together and thinking some for schools also in that sense here. And actually, and the other thing is that actually before I came here, I was teaching in a German Portuguese school in São Paulo, a bilingual school in São Paulo, which is actually called Humboldt College, college there, Colégio Humboldt. In Portuguese, college is just school, you know. So, and I was trying already to bring a little bit of this perspective of philosophy as a way of life. And I do think, because they also, it's one of those private schools and they have so many programs for things that students can do after the usual classes and so on. And I think that could also be an interesting way to make a connection there. Maybe having, I think they would be also interested, because, you know, especially talking about Bildung and Humboldt, I'm sure something could be, a connection could be made there. But yeah, just a few thoughts, and thank you so much for that. It was very fascinating.
Yeah.
I wonder, I'll see if I can distill those for conversation. I was thinking, like, first one of the local communal versus the global cosmopolitan. One way this comes up in philosophy as a way of life is there's a lot of emphasis, I think, in, well, first, just to mention that Hadot says like all pre-modern, most of pre-modern philosophy as a way of life traditions were intentionally done for community for all the reasons you point to, because the exercises are not so effective as this highly privatized, individualized affair. And in addition, that these communities and figures, there's a reason this word cosmopolitan, but also atopos, sort of without place strangeness, is applied to Western philosophy, because there is this struggle between how do you cultivate yourself rooted to a place and sensitivity while, you know, remaining open, having a bigger perspective. And I know, as you know, you were talking about this sort of sensitivity to sort of place and context in community living. I would just be curious for the thoughts between the local and global. And then speaking of that, the two contexts you gave, Lucas, I think are interesting, of like, are you thinking about the European or Latin American context, particularly thinking where so much is public and so much is university driven, you know, like even the semester gap year, unless you do like an Erasmus semester in Europe between institutions, the logic is not built there quite the way it is in the US. So how are you thinking about those other contexts as well? Not sure if that's a fair estimation, but those were the two that sort of struck me from that might be useful for a broad conversation.
I'll maybe speak a little bit. I can speak just briefly to the local rootedness aspect. I think we want to be clear. How do I say, when a student goes to Seguinland Institute, or they go to Thoreau College in Viroqua, or sometimes they'll go to a very, very remote place in Alaska or so, the intention is not that the student stays there and becomes connected to that community or that place for the rest of their life. But the intention is that the student develops the tools, the skills to know how to become rooted to a place. I've heard a story from a student who went to a program in Alaska, and they learned the names of the trees and the birds and the wildlife there. At Seguinland Institute, I think they, you learn about the flora and the fauna. You have the foraged feast, and people learn what plants there that are edible or so. And and this student who went to Alaska said, oh, now I know all the plants here, but I have no idea what plants are in my hometown. But they made a commitment to go back and learn what was there. In The Nordic Secret, Lena Anderson writes about the concept of expanding one's circle of belonging, that one first learns to belong to oneself, then to a family group, then to a wider community group, and eventually a nation state, the world. and one could say the cosmos even. And I think that's our aim in this, again, is not to, not to just develop a hyper-local view, but that you view the world differently. You learn the general through the specific. Yeah. And so, I think one thing we see on college campuses a lot in the US today is protesting major issues, divesting from oil or whatever. And it's very hard for students, I think, to feel impact in that way. What can I do except go out and hold a sign or sit in, or it's hard to feel that you have any impact in that way. And yet when you start to work on a local issue, you can immediately see, we addressed the housing crisis in our community by, we were able to support the building of 3 houses or whatever it is. You can, and so I think it's,
I have some examples on that score too, Cam.
Go ahead.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go. You take it.
No, just I always have in the back of my mind too that for me, one of the purposes of education is to create hope. And in the second of the progression of courses that students take here, we call it the Good Life for All. And that frame shifts to the broader community and the pressing issues of our time. And my goal in that course is always for students to encounter 20 people and organizations in this area that are embodiments of that hope, that are doing meaningful work that just instantiates that abstract idea of hope. And then for students to perpetuate that, we read Philosophies of Hope, Ernst Bloch and Rebecca Solnit and others, and then we explore instances of hope and engage with that idea that hope is always in need of embodiment, so that students, having encountered people in this area that are doing specific things to build climate resilience or food security for folks around here, will explore something parallel in their own communities or whatever place that they commit to in the future. So just saying again what Cam said, we're trying to give them a very concrete and particular example here that they can then extrapolate from and apply in their future contexts.
Yeah. I think on your second question, Ellie, and then, it's good to see you back, Chris. On the second question, I think it is a challenge to, how do I say, I'm personally not very aware of the specifics of education in Latin America or Europe even or so, but I will say it's a challenge even in this country. Sometimes we have schools that are on the quarter system that want to develop partnerships, and it's very hard to get that to fit in sometimes. I work with a program in Alaska that has a semester program, and they want it to be more built around the, from the spring through the fall is the best time in Alaska to be there. And so they struggle sometimes, because sometimes they're cutting into their beginning is at what might be the end of the spring semester at a college, and it goes into the beginning of the fall semester. So there are definitely awkwardnesses to the model. I think in some ways it just is, and it speaks to the hyper locality and the need for the the proliferation of models.
I'm going to let Lucas go just into his question, and then we'll pass to Chris to see if the internet's being kind here. So Lucas and then Chris. Lucas, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just to add a brief comment on this relationship between the local and the community and the broader, reach. I'd say, in a sense, this is kind of being a little provocative, but I think this is a completely false problem if we think that one of the most influential philosophers of the history of philosophy was Socrates. And I'm sorry, but he was talking only to a bunch of people around him. he didn't even write anything. So I think this really renders this point moot, in my opinion, to be honest.
Well, I mean, there's the whole literature built around him of that care of the self, his care of the community, his care of the city. There is this, I do think one of the through threads, and to do our global philosophy example, where I see lots of PWL correlates in, Neo-Confucianism, there's this assumption that Ren, like to cultivate humaneness, is to become attentive to oneself and the world around you at sort of different levels. And that sort of attentional thoughtfulness is what puts you in line with the way of things, with the Tao Shui, the greater learning, which is really the sort of way or processes of learning you get in alignment. And I really do think if I were one way I would talk about correlates, I'd be seeing both. Is like that idea is very clear throughout the tradition. And I would even echo it's because people are trying to do these sort of whole person learning communities. And I think that comes very clear when you're in the learning process.
I wanted to add to the local thing just to say that like the traditional dialectic here where you're worried about somebody being provincial doesn't quite apply, because the people who are arriving at Seguinland, right, Philip, they are being unsettled by suddenly being in this local environment that is non-consumerist, that is non-cell phone based, that you're staying in a treehouse. Like, so they're having the experience of being unsettled. Same thing out at Tideline or Outer Coast. So it's not exactly the same. They're heading out of their comfort zone to encounter a very different space in these microcolleges.
I actually have a question for the PWL people and for you folks at Boston College. I'm curious on this second question. We've asked the question of what sort of training prepares a professor to teach or guide spiritual exercises at a microcollege. And I guess I'm curious, one, from the students, if you feel you're getting that at Boston College, and from those of you in the PWL community, do you feel you're providing that education for your students, or is your focus totally different from that? Yeah. Putting you on the spot there, Paul and Sarah, huh? So yes.
I can step out if they want to complain about the program.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the example that you shared, Phil, a little bit about how at Seguinland, right, it's like this all-in model of teaching in some ways, of the commitment that's there. And I'm wondering like what shape that would even take out of like a more traditional quote unquote like institution like UC, right? Where that expectation isn't necessarily the same, but in some ways the workload might be, and often is. And so how do you maybe shift the proportions where it is maybe the more human balance, right? Of like more time actually spent encountering students or like in those sort of human ways. Because it's also, our encounters are often limited to classrooms or office hours, maybe the occasional walk around campus or something like that where you run into someone. And so I'm imagining a lot of the formative moments at places like Finland are also the non-curriculum, right? Like it's like all the other things too. So yeah, those are kind of some.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I appreciate that. Yeah, how to shift those priorities in a traditional university context, I don't know. It's very hard if you haven't built it in from the ground up. And then you kind of have the circumstance where it's like, you're having to go above and beyond what would be expected of your department chair, and probably not necessarily rewarded for that at all. And I think we can all, hopefully we all have had experiences in higher ed where, yeah, that time that you went to coffee with your professor and just two other students, and it was so impactful because it was outside of that classroom context, or the Buddhism professor took you to a meditation hall. You never forget that thing. But again, that tends to be the exception in the traditional college setting, because you're absolutely right. Some of the most meaningful conversations I've had with students over the years haven't just been in the midst of our formal conversations in the classroom, but when I'm in a canoe with a student and we're canoeing out to an island, and it's just, you're in that different setting, or you're walking out of the cookhouse and someone's walking in, and you just a moment emerges. You want to ideally have a setting where that just those kind of interactions can happen just spontaneously all the time, every day, and it's intense, but it's but it's very fulfilling too, and you can see the impact there. But you do feel like you're on the line too. I would say that I've kind of underestimated that. You're not just encountering students in that controlled space of the classroom where you're sort of you know that setting better than anybody, and you're the master of that domain. And this is, you're bumping into them on the bridge when you were trying to walk home and you're zonked from a long day, but they've got a question for you in that moment, or you're eating veggie burgers together, and something comes up over about coleslaw, and then that leads to a question about the meaning of life.
I'm going to read Chris's comments since we finally got through these unfortunate technical jumps. But if you ask faculty about education reform, they simply want to talk about curriculum change. Content transfer is important, but it's not the whole story. What Segoinland is sculpting attitude and affect. We need to teach openness, caring, teamwork, meaning, seeing others' perspective. And yeah, I totally agree. And I think as Chris well knows, with people like Black Mountain College, that come up in his book, like the history of these holistic learning experiments, humane learning projects, philosophy as a way of life. I think you see this echoed again and again. So like to just give to that question about the training issue, this is why Petrarch and actually the founding of humanism, if you pay close attention, isn't recentering on the human subject, like many modern writers do. It's a complaint about what university teaching is like, the medieval institutions. You get this boring reading of Aristotle, but I'm not moved to transform myself to become a more open, thoughtful, caring, sensitive purpose. This is to go concrete of where this question gets thorny and interesting is like, where's a model of a school that still tries to figure out how to do this? Well, St. John's, both the Annapolis and Santa Fe campus, when you apply, it's still, you have this, at least 2 years ago, you still had to send in your physical materials. Having a PhD or MA is not only not a prerequisite, but sometimes they think is an inhibition instead of a virtue. They actually ask you to talk about what's your relationship to these books. Why are they important to you? How do you think about dialoguing with others about the big questions of life and learning? So often many of the faculty they get are like, MSs, they might be working at some scientific institute. They may have had an entirely other career. They may have spent part of their time in the academy or not. And their answer why to do this is because they think as soon as you focus on the merit of your area of speciality and your sort of scholarly chops, you get into trouble. And, my short answer is like part of the challenge of figuring out how to cultivate faculty is there's just not very many training programs in this. I mean, in fact, one of the things exciting about Chris's program and other places is how do we build more channels? Because I don't think there's very organized spaces. And like one other, just of like how, perennial I think the scope of issue is now what's considered the Confucian canon is by this guy Zhu Xi. This is what it's called, the 4 books. And it's like it became what, people had to do these terrible rote memorization exams if you wanted a bureaucratic position in the Chinese government. But that curriculum actually started out because the Southern Song Empire was collapsing. And he had this idea that if you made sort of, let's call them microcollege spaces where people learn to intentionally live together, and you actually help them serve their local communities by having a role in agricultural production. There's this model called the community contract. Then you could create places that had some self-autonomy about different values of living in the world. And you also could sort of reinforce for Confucian scholars that their job is to support those communities, not teach for the civil service exam. In fact, he was trying to simplify the curriculum. The problem I see was revealing is what happened, which is now a generation later, it was like, okay, please read Zhu Xi on what organic human cultivation is like and write the 5, paragraph essay about why that's important. My sort of analogy for modern audience that I think is a very PWL one is, please write to me an essay in your teacher education class about why John Dewey thinks rote schooling exercises don't lead to deep living. Or please, this is something we often talk about in PWL studies about, please, let's write more scholarship about Hadot's complaints about the way we do scholarship, is like a very easy trap to fall into. So I do think there's both like a perennial struggle is, and I think part of the other answer is like we need programs, but they do have to acknowledge this, that it's really something different to do with. And like last thing I'll say about this is yet another way it comes up in philosophy's way of life studies. And I sent some links to some sort of pedagogy and thinking about like what it means to build these curriculum in bigger universities, like both a collection of articles and actually a project out of Notre Dame. But one thing that come up in both is like, can you really do this whole person learning thing in current universities of higher education? Or do you have to at least do it adjacent to the side? Because the worry is so many structures in current higher education incentivize sort of institutional patterns. So like, maybe the question for you too is, I would end with, as we're wrapping up here, at least for me, is like, how do you think about the relationship to institutional higher education because of that tension, which I know Chris has spent lots of his life working on, and I know Philip and Cam, you're like contending with all the time. Like, how do you think about that balance point between the two poles?
One thing we're working to do at Springboard is to develop partnerships with colleges and universities. Will colleges and universities allow their students to go for a semester or 2 semesters to a Seguinland Institute, to a Tideland Institute as part of their educational program? And we believe we have a case to be made for that. There are, we do not yet, because the programs are too small and too few students, we don't have like really excellent quantitative data on it yet, but we have the hypothesis that if students spend a semester or a year at a program like Seguinland Institute, they are more likely to go back and complete college, complete. And dropout is an increasing problem at college campuses. And so we believe there is actually an economic case to be made for encouraging students to spend a semester at a Seguinland Institute or a comparable microcollege. I think, it's interesting. The other, I guess, maybe challenger that I'll put on that is, so the folk high schools in the Nordic countries, they were very specifically not offering college credit. It was like, one thing it says in the Nordic Secret is that it was very clear it was learning for learning's sake. They very specifically did not give any all you got at the end was you got a piece of paper that said you were there, and that was it. And that was like important and central and key to their model, that you were just there and learning because learning was valuable. And at Springboard, I think we made the strategic decision that wasn't really possible. We primarily wanted to support and work with programs that were offering college credit. One, because it's too big of an ask for students to be able to spend money and time on something that's not leading toward a credential of some sort. And two, I think because we do believe the intellectual component is a really important part of whole person education. We are not against academic learning. In fact, we're very much for academic learning. And so ensuring our programs are able to offer college credit or somehow credentialized by a college or university is important to us. So that's a little bit how we've approached it and are approaching it. But again, there are challenges. Philip, I'll let you talk more about what are the...
No, just briefly, I would echo what Cam said and just say, I would love to just see the flourishing of microcolleges with all sorts of different relationships to higher ed, some that are more housed within a traditional college or university, like an honors college is within, but has its distinctive quality. It would have to be even more distinctive while being within, to some that are totally independent, like us. We're independent. We have an affiliation with the University of Maine through which our students get their college credit, but we're independent. They're not, reviewing the details of our curriculum at all. So anyways, I'd like to see a flourishing of all those things. But more importantly, I wanted to come back to Chris Nye's comment there about the affective quality and maybe even in my examples, I emphasize too much some of these curricular examples, but I do think that affective element, the context that you set, the attitude that you cultivate around learning and transformation and a greater sense of the common good, does actually most of the work for you. One way that translates for us, I mean, the intentionality of the spaces, tree houses, to create a sense of whimsy and lightheartedness and joy, but also just the engagement with the arts and aesthetic experiences, shared aesthetic experiences. Like I said, I mean, we begin every day, no matter what the philosophical conversation is, by listening to a song together or singing a song together, and hearing some poetry. And just always want our students to have a sense that art and artists and musicians and film, that is the context in which we are discussing and living out all of these things. So yeah, Chris Higgins could tell us a lot about how that functioned at Black Mountain College, which is certainly an influence on us as well. But yeah, so just echoing that, the importance of that affective and aesthetic element.
I'm thinking of a comment of our friend Justin Reynolds at Gull Island.
Mhm.
He said at our panel at the Philosophy of Ed Society, he said, "My definition of a microcollege is an embodied critique of traditional higher education." And he went on to say that he hopes that the students that come for the goal term go back and raise hell at their home institutions. That's a model of how we...
I think that's true. And I hear that from various colleges and programs, but they do go back. They raise the hell and they finish. So yes.
I wonder if there's some, and I think we find it, I'll end with on the philosophy as way of life side, I would think there's a similar spread of relationships to that question about whether philosophy as a way of life can and should be in the university. Some people very in it and scholarly, some at the edges. And somehow we're able to hold a big tent together that includes many people that are incredulous of the relationship, but that's also like productive for it. So, I mean, as a sort of one transition to closing out here, and also for the audience, because many people will listen in later, is, you know, in philosophy as way of life world, we're also with people doing sort of philosophical coaching and therapy, which often sits outside or just figuring out certification. For example, a philosophical health model with Louis de Miranda, who's a colleague. There's also centers like Royal Holloway Center for Modern Stoicism that does lots of retreats and intensives. And then there are, you know, some places that are sort of experimenting within the curriculum themselves and sort of smaller college experiments. So very modestly, I think the Culture, Thought, and Humanity programs at Wrocław are trying to do some. There is in Dharma College in California, that's a great books program, but global, they have contemplation programming. Interestingly, United International College, which has a different acronym now, but is in Zhuhai in China, has been trying this East-West, classic Confucian arts, which includes interesting trying to attempts to figure out how to do some of the ritual practice and archery and even sort of a version of horseback riding with the sort of classic liberal arts tradition. So one thing I hope we do out of these conversations is find ways to continually collaborate and reinforce at different levels. I was also just, for example, talking to a colleague who's worked in the wide range of humanism societies and organizations that are in the United States and globally, from ethical culture to the more secular humanistic to the more pluralistic, looking for, you know, opportunities to develop pastoral care programming. So all to say, I hope this is like an entryway to some conversations with, I think, people with a lot of shared ethos. We also now have in the audience David Haney, who's a former president of Century College and Hiram College, who did a lovely talk about both the challenges but also real cared commitment for this space. So that was a long way to say thank you so much. You can see I think this is a really important issue, and we have some really cool and interesting people on these full spread of spaces. So for those listening in or who attended, I hope we use this as a sort of doorway to think about, also opportunities we could do together. And, I included that, with Chris and those students over there in formative ed. I hope you're thinking about ways we can think about this. Also includes, I should mention, Palinode, which is the other organization co-sponsoring these seminars, which is thinking, both online and offline in-person ways to promote deep philosophy and humanities opportunities for people at this moment of, real transition. So doors open. I hope this gave people lots of ideas, and let's give Cam and Philip another round of applause for really a great presentation and discussion.
Thank you.